So one of the key questions that comes often when someone is becoming non-UK tax resident or breaking the UK tax ties is that once they've moved outside of the UK, how often they can come to the UK, and when they do come to the UK, what are the situations where a UK tax residency can trigger? Maybe it's a short-term visit or a long-term visit, and how does the HMRC looks at these things, right? So this is what we're going to discuss today, and I'm joined by Laura Sand, who's a partner at LSR Partners in the UK. Laura, thank you for joining us today.
No worries at all, Shiraz. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Laura, the question that I put together, right? How does this work? So in terms of coming back to the UK once you have become a non-tax resident.
So I think the way that the statutory residence test works, the answer is in terms of how long can I spend back in the UK is going to very much, the answer is going to be, it depends. In general, the more things you have going on in the UK, the less time you can spend in the UK, whilst you're a UK tax non-resident. I think the big thing to be aware of, just say, but like you have some people who maybe say, well, I'm going to get residence in Dubai, I'm going to get residence in another country, but I'm actually just going to carry on living in the UK. But because I'm resident in Dubai, I'm going to pay tax out there and not in the UK. That's not the way that the statutory residence test works. So it is one of those where if you are leaving the UK and planning on breaking residence, you have actually really got to go and live outside of the UK. Suppose it's probably easier to talk about a few of maybe the easier tests, but a few of the tests that maybe would provide a bit more clarity. But there's a couple of tests which are automatic overseas tests, which means if you meet those tests, you would be automatically considered to be non-resident in the UK. And if you meet those tests, in general, they'll get considered before your automatic UK tests. So if you meet those criteria, you can kind of go, okay, I'm relatively comfortable that those tests might apply. So the first test is if you're in your first 3 years of non-residence, if you spend no more than 15 midnights in the UK during a particular tax year, you would be automatically non-resident. Alternatively, if you're in your 4th or later year of non-residence, then you have up to 45 midnights to spend in the UK and remain non-resident. The final kind of automatic overseas test, standard test, is full-time work outside of the UK. You'd obviously need to make sure you're meeting other criteria to meet that criteria of full-time work outside of the UK, but that would actually give you up to 90 midnights in the UK during a particular tax year. And that's quite a popular test for being considered non-resident by people who are looking at leaving the UK to go and work outside of the UK.
Sure, thank you. And one more connected question is that when someone comes back to UK and they have a place to live, maybe they have their own home that they have converted into a rental property, short-term rental property as an Airbnb, but they pause the Airbnb and live in that property for the time period that they are there, or they have a spare room in their parents' home, like to use that while they're in the UK, or using, just regular hotels, right? So having a property, living in your parents' property, or friends, family, how does that impact? Is there any impact on the tax residency or anything that can be connected back to it? Or maybe just they have a rented home that they don't do anything with it until they come back and just live their holidays and then move out and the home stays vacant.
Yeah. So the home can kind of home/accommodation can cause challenges in terms of UK tax residence position. In terms of the automatic tests, it doesn't necessarily impact. We've seen historically people travelling out outside of the UK for work purposes, and their family, say for example, the kids are in 6th form and need to go, and need to keep them keep them where they are, I suppose, not rock the boat in terms of their we quite often will see that one family member will leave the UK to undertake their role outside of the UK, and the other family member will remain. If you're going to be automatically non-resident, the home situation might not be too much of a challenge. If you do have a home in the UK, let's go for something that's the most straightforward, like you own a home, you leave the UK, but you want that home to be available to you for the duration of your time outside of the UK. The reality is that can cause you some issues, both from an accommodation tie in the submission ties test, but also potentially from having your only home in the UK. Again, if it shouldn't matter too much if you are physically relocating to the other country and you obtain a permanent home in the other country. And when I'm talking about permanent home, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be an owned home. It can be a rented home, but you have to have a degree of security and permanence in the other country. If, for example, you ended up, you could end up in a situation where you could become UK tax resident by means of having your only home in the UK. If you don't have a home outside of the UK, equally, you could find that maybe having an accommodation tied to the UK means that if you don't meet those automatic overseas tests, you could end up becoming UK tax resident. And if you are tax resident in both the UK and the country that you've travelled to, you can end up in a situation where you have to look at the double tax treaty and figuring out which country has the right to consider you as treaty resident. And again, when it comes to that, we have a series of tiebreakers. The first tiebreaker, in the majority of instances where there are tiebreakers anyway, the first tiebreaker is in which country do you have a permanent home available to you. So I suppose in terms of having a home, that can certainly cause you challenges and potentially demonstrate to HMRC that maybe you're not necessarily breaking residence. If, for example, you owned a home, and you find it quite often with people who leave the UK having, they have a property that they own. In a large number of instances, if the relocation outside of the UK is permanent or fairly permanent, people will either look to sell the property or they will look to rent it out. Because if they're not making use of it, there's a mortgage that needs to be covered, for example. If the property's rented out kind of on a long-term basis, so it's not actually available to you, that generally tends to take away most issues associated with owning your home. And I suppose in terms of if you were selling it, for example, if you moved all your furniture out of the property, if you never stayed in the property, etc., then I suppose 9 times out of 10, that's not going to cause you an issue either, because home is one of the grey areas on the statutory residence test where generally, like HMRC they'll look at the actual, like, what's going on in terms of the home. If the property is not available to be used as a home because, for example, it has no beds, it has no sofas, etc., then if it's just a barren shell, then it's actually not available to be used as a home, and therefore it would not be considered a home as such.
Another connected question would be about the bank accounts. So if someone is visiting the UK, can they use the UK-based bank accounts? So, maybe they have some savings, maybe they have some income coming in, let's say a rental income in from within the UK, and they say, okay, like I can keep this money here in British pounds, and when I come to the UK, I can use that for my family expenses, travel and stuff. So would that receiving income in the UK bank accounts and using that bank account for their expenses in the UK, does that triggers any residency issues?
So using a UK bank account in itself shouldn't, in principle, trigger any sort of UK tax residence issues. If you are looking at leaving the UK, or if you're outside of the UK but you have a UK bank account, it is worth making sure that the bank is aware that you're leaving the UK. I think the main reason being, and I couldn't tell you which banks and which countries, but some banks will have issues or won't kind of keep certain accounts open if you are tax resident in certain countries. So it may be that if you talk to your bank, tell them that you're leaving the UK, tell them that you've left the UK, they might be able to direct you to potentially an alternative option, bank account option that's available to you. Quite often, I think they will have GBP expat accounts if they don't have if you're not allowed kind of your standard accounts. But I think you need to let them know because again, I think banks have a bit of a duty to report certain things to HMRC. And if you are a UK tax non-resident, for example, but the bank thinks you're a UK tax resident and you're receiving a whole bunch of income from outside of the UK, they might think that maybe something needs reporting to HMRC that they might then in turn just report it to them, which again can cause challenges if you haven't dotted your I's and crossed your T's and told HMRC where you're going and what you're doing.
Sure, that makes sense. Also, it's the same, quite similar to Dubai. Like once you come to Dubai, become a resident, we open resident accounts that can be current account with checkbooks. But once you leave
Yeah.
Dubai, you have to tell the bank, and the bank can not converts, but closes your current account that was your resident account and
Yeah.
opens a non-resident savings account that has those checkbooks.
Yeah, which makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Laura, today for your time. It was a helpful session.
No worries, Sharad. Thanks for having me again.
Well, that's it for today. And if you want to break UK tax residency or move to Dubai, you can reach out and work with me and Laura with the links that will be in the description below. That's it for today, and we'll see you in the next video.